When investigators receive a ransom note, they usually begin by asking one simple question. Did the writer actually know something that only the kidnapper could have known? Most ransom notes fall apart almost immediately because they contain vague threats, public information, or details copied from news reports. But according to former FBI officials who have spoken publicly about the Nancy Guthrie case, two particular letters stood apart from all the others. They contained information that, at least at first glance, appeared to come from someone who had been inside Nancy's home. That single fact changed the conversation, and it is one of the reasons this case continues to puzzle investigators today. Nancy Guthrie disappeared from her home in Tucson, Arizona, under circumstances that were unusual from the very beginning. Security footage captured a masked individual approaching the house during the night, creating one of the most recognizable images connected to the investigation. Despite thousands of tips and months of investigative work, the identity of that person has never been publicly confirmed. According to investigators, more than 23,000 leads have been received, and every one has required careful review. Yet the mystery remains unsolved. As the public tried to understand what had happened, another mystery emerged. Several letters, claiming to be connected to Nancy's disappearance, began attracting attention. Some appeared through media outlets. Others were reportedly sent directly to local television stations. Before long, people were asking an important question. Were any of these letters genuine, or were they simply attempts by attention seekers to insert themselves into a high-profile investigation? According to former FBI personnel discussing the case, it is important not to treat all of the letters as though they came from the same person. They explained that the widely discussed notes circulating through entertainment media appeared to be separate from two earlier letters that were received by local television stations. That distinction matters because investigators reportedly viewed those first two letters very differently. The first letter reportedly opened with a chilling message announcing that the writer had Nancy and demanding millions of dollars in exchange for her safe return. At first glance, it sounded similar to many ransom notes investigators have encountered over the years. There was a demand for money, a deadline, and an implied threat if those demands were ignored. But another detail stood out. Former FBI officials explained that the letter included information that had never been widely shared with the public. According to discussions about the investigation, the writer accurately described the location of Nancy's Apple Watch inside the home. Not only did the note mention the watch, but it reportedly described exactly where it had been left inside the bedroom. Investigators believed that detail was significant because it suggested the writer had either been inside the house or had received information from someone who had. That was not the only specific detail. The same letter also reportedly mentioned a broken floodlight at the back of the property. Again, this was not the sort of observation someone would normally make by simply reading newspaper articles or watching television coverage. According to those familiar with the investigation, there was in fact a damaged floodlight behind the home. Whether that knowledge came directly from the offender or through another source remains uncertain, but investigators reportedly viewed it as another reason to examine the letter carefully. At first, that seemed straightforward. If someone knew private details about the home, perhaps they were directly involved in Nancy's disappearance. But experienced investigators are trained to be cautious. They know that apparent insider knowledge does not automatically prove authenticity. One former FBI official pointed out that the crime scene had been busy during the early stages of the investigation. Numerous people entered and exited the property as emergency personnel, investigators, and others responded. Under those circumstances, it remains possible that private information could have been unintentionally shared before becoming part of a false ransom attempt. That possibility means investigators had to balance two competing ideas. The note might have come from the offender, or it might have been written by someone who learned details indirectly. According to reports, the ransom demand itself also raised questions. The writer allegedly demanded $4 million and warned that the amount would increase if payment was delayed. Despite the frightening message, investigators reportedly advised Nancy's family not to pay. Former FBI officials explained that there was no confirmed proof that Nancy was alive, and without proof of life, sending such a large payment carried enormous risk. Families facing kidnappings often hope that paying quickly will save a loved one, but investigators generally look for evidence that the victim is still alive before recommending any ransom payment. That would have been the end of it if events had followed the pattern investigators expected. Instead, less than a week later, another letter reportedly arrived. This second message was unlike almost any ransom communication experienced investigators could remember. Rather than continuing to demand money, the writer allegedly claimed that Nancy had died and that her death had not been intentional. The note reportedly stated that she had been buried with nature, yet it made no further request for payment. That immediately created a new mystery. If financial gain had truly been the motive, why stop asking for money? Why tell the family she was gone without attempting to negotiate for the return of her remains? Even former FBI officials admitted that this behavior did not fit the pattern they normally associate with ransom cases. Some wondered whether the writer felt guilt. Others questioned whether the message had been written by someone trying to shape a future legal defense. The exact answer remains unclear, but the unusual nature of those two letters continues to make them one of the most debated pieces of evidence in the entire investigation. And that brings us to the next question. If the letters really contained authentic insider knowledge, why has identifying the person behind them proven so difficult? The second letter changed the direction of the conversation almost overnight. Up until that point, investigators were dealing with what appeared to be a traditional ransom demand. There was a victim, a demand for money, and at least the possibility that paying could lead to a safe return. But according to former FBI officials discussing the case, the second message abandoned that familiar pattern completely. Instead of demanding more money, the writer reportedly claimed that Nancy had died and insisted her death had not been intentional. It was an unexpected turn that left even experienced investigators searching for answers. At first, the explanation seemed difficult to accept. Former FBI investigators pointed out that kidnappers motivated by money almost always continue negotiating for as long as they believe they can still profit. Even in tragic situations where a victim dies, investigators often expect offenders to conceal that fact, while continuing to pressure the family for payment. In this case, however, the reported communication took the opposite approach. According to those familiar with the discussion, the writer voluntarily claimed Nancy was no longer alive, but made no attempt to ask for additional money or offer the return of her remains in exchange for payment. That unusual decision immediately raised new questions about the offender's motive. One former FBI official admitted he had never encountered another kidnapping case that followed this pattern. From an investigative standpoint, it simply did not make sense. If financial gain had been the primary objective, announcing the victim's death without continuing negotiations would remove almost all leverage. Families desperately want answers, but once the possibility of rescue disappears, the dynamics of a ransom case change dramatically. Then, something unexpected happened. Rather than dismissing the letter outright, investigators began asking whether it revealed something about the person who wrote it. One possibility discussed publicly was guilt. Perhaps the writer genuinely felt remorse and wanted the family to know what had happened. Another theory suggested something more calculated. If the writer anticipated being arrested one day, claiming the death was accidental rather than intentional, might later be presented as evidence that there had never been a plan to commit murder. According to the discussion, that possibility crossed investigators' minds, although no evidence has publicly confirmed that theory. Even so, experienced investigators urged caution. They reminded viewers that criminal behavior often refuses to fit neatly into familiar categories. Some offenders act rationally, others do not. One former FBI official explained that while investigators often search for logical motives, they also recognize that some offenders make decisions that appear inconsistent or impulsive. That uncertainty makes profiling especially difficult in unusual cases like this one. That brings us to another mystery. If the offender behaved so unpredictably, why has the investigation still failed to identify the masked individual seen outside Nancy's home? When surveillance images of the masked porch visitor were released, many observers believed an arrest would follow quickly. The footage appeared to provide investigators with a valuable lead. Yet months later, authorities were still reviewing evidence, following tips, and searching for answers. According to former FBI officials, one reason is simply the enormous volume of information investigators have had to process. Reports indicate that more than 23,000 tips have been submitted. Every one of those leads must be evaluated, compared against existing evidence, and either confirmed or eliminated. Even with modern investigative tools, that process requires an extraordinary amount of time. Another challenge involves the area surrounding Nancy's neighborhood. Investigators reportedly began cataloging every vehicle captured by nearby traffic cameras during the days leading up to and following the disappearance. Imagine thousands of hours of nighttime footage, each vehicle logged and organized so that if a suspect vehicle is eventually identified, investigators can quickly determine where it appeared and when. According to those familiar with the investigation, artificial intelligence has reportedly assisted with organizing this enormous amount of video data, but even advanced technology cannot instantly solve a case if the original images are limited. Former investigators also explained that Tucson presents its own unique difficulties. The city is known for preserving dark skies by limiting light pollution. That benefits astronomy and residents who enjoy clear night skies, but it creates serious challenges for criminal investigations. Many residential streets have very little artificial lighting. Surveillance cameras operating under those conditions often capture grainy images that are difficult to enhance. A figure wearing a mask in the middle of the night may remain frustratingly difficult to identify, even with sophisticated software. There is another detail that investigators have discussed publicly. Early in the investigation, authorities reportedly searched for electronic clues that might place someone near the Guthrie home. Cell phone tower records, nearby electronic devices, and other forms of digital evidence were all considered. Officials have also spoken about using specialized investigative technology that is not available to the public. Yet despite these efforts, investigators acknowledged that technology alone cannot create evidence that simply is not there. If a suspect leaves very few traces, even experienced investigators face an uphill battle. One of the more encouraging developments involves forensic evidence. According to former FBI officials, investigators recovered DNA samples and hair fragments that reportedly did not belong to members of the Guthrie family. However, some of the DNA consisted of mixed samples, making laboratory analysis more complicated and time-consuming. While those forensic clues continue to offer hope, officials have been careful not to suggest they have identified a suspect through that evidence alone. For Nancy's family, every passing week has meant living with uncertainty. Every new report brings hope that the mystery may finally be solved, only to be followed by another reminder that many questions remain unanswered. Investigators continue to review evidence, compare forensic results, and examine every credible lead, knowing that a single overlooked detail could change everything. But another question refuses to go away. If investigators believe the first ransom note contained information that only someone close to the crime should have known, does that mean the author is the masked individual seen on the porch? Or could someone else have possessed that knowledge without ever appearing on camera? As investigators continued examining the evidence, another debate began to grow. It had nothing to do with the ransom demand itself. Instead, it centered on whether the investigation was finally moving toward an arrest. Every few weeks, new reports seemed to suggest that authorities were getting close. For Nancy Guthrie's family, those reports offered hope. But according to former FBI officials familiar with how these investigations work, hope and evidence are not always the same thing. One public claim suggested investigators were closing in on the masked individual seen outside Nancy's home. It was a statement that quickly spread through news reports and social media. Understandably, many people assumed an arrest might be only days away. But former FBI investigators questioned that wording. They explained that law enforcement rarely says it is closing in unless investigators already know exactly who they are looking for and are preparing to make an arrest. Normally, officials are much more cautious. They might say they have promising leads or that they are following up on new information. Saying they are closing in suggests a level of certainty that, according to those involved in the public discussion, simply did not match what they were hearing from sources connected to the investigation. That brings us to another important point. While rumors often spread quickly, experienced investigators prefer to focus on facts that can be verified. According to reporters who have consistently covered the case, FBI personnel were still reviewing evidence, processing thousands of tips, and cataloging surveillance footage. They reportedly had no publicly identified suspect at that stage of the investigation. That may sound discouraging, but history tells us that cold cases are sometimes solved years after they first appear to go quiet. Former FBI officials pointed to other major investigations, where a single tip, a forgotten witness, or advances in forensic science eventually broke the case open. The Unabomber investigation is one example often mentioned. It took more than a decade before information from someone who recognized the writing style helped investigators identify the suspect. Cases involving unidentified offenders have also been solved years later through improved DNA analysis or renewed public attention. That possibility remains very real in Nancy Guthrie's case. Authorities reportedly continue examining physical evidence collected during the investigation. Hair fragments recovered from the scene and DNA samples that did not belong to members of the Guthrie family remain important pieces of evidence. Some of those samples are mixed, making them more difficult to analyze, but advances in forensic technology continue to improve what laboratories can accomplish over time. Meanwhile, investigators have continued reviewing surveillance footage from surrounding neighborhoods, traffic cameras, and electronic records. It is painstaking work. Hours of video must be examined frame by frame. Vehicle movements must be compared. Timelines have to match. Even with artificial intelligence assisting certain tasks, experienced investigators still have to verify every significant finding themselves. Looking back, one fact continues to stand above almost every other piece of evidence in this case. The first ransom note reportedly contained details that appeared to describe the inside of Nancy's home with surprising accuracy. Whether that information came directly from the offender or reached someone through another path has never been publicly resolved. But according to former FBI officials, those details were significant enough that investigators treated the letter as potentially authentic rather than dismissing it as another hoax. Even today, many of the biggest questions remain unanswered. Who wrote the two letters? Why did the second message abandon the ransom demand altogether? Was the masked individual on the porch also the author of the notes, or were multiple people involved? And if investigators eventually identify the writer, will that finally reveal what happened to Nancy Guthrie? Those are questions that only future evidence can answer. For Nancy's family, every new lead represents another chance for the truth to emerge. For investigators, the case remains active, with every credible tip carefully reviewed. And for those following the story, it is a reminder that some mysteries are solved not by one dramatic breakthrough, but by patient investigation, careful forensic work, and one crucial piece of information arriving at exactly the right time. What do you think? Do you believe the details inside the first ransom note point directly to someone who was inside Nancy Guthrie's home, or could those details have been learned another way? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective may raise a question others haven't considered. If you enjoy thoughtful, fact-based investigations into cases like this one, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We'll continue following important developments and bringing you carefully researched stories as new information becomes available.